All right, welcome to Philosophy TV. My name is Michael Strevens. I'm a professor of philosophy at New York University.
And I'm JD Trout. I'm a professor of philosophy and psychology at Loyola University in Chicago.
And we're going to talk today about explanation and understanding in science and beyond. So when I teach this topic, I usually begin at the beginning of the 20th century, when the notion of explanation in science, which seems to be the highest object of scientific inquiry to many people today, had been declared more or less dead for philosophical reasons. That is to say, the possibility of explanation was thought to be a kind of a superstition, unscientific. Would you agree with that, JD?
Yeah, I think that was the consensus, especially early in the 20th century.
In effect, the tissue of explanation was some kind of deep metaphysical understanding of the way things worked. And this sort of understanding was thought to be off limits to science. Science could only grasp appearances, regularities. It could not see deeply into the reasons for things. And so explanation per se was something that scientists shouldn't try to pursue. They shouldn't try to understand phenomena. They should just try to describe them.
Right. I mean, there was such an impetus for an anti-metaphysical stance that principles in the early 20th century, like the verifiability principle, was kind of used as a metaphysics filter. And a lot of the questions surrounding issues of explanation and understanding seem to not have the kind of sense that early 20th century philosophers looked for in their work.
So then everything changed. All of a sudden, people were talking about explanation again, beginning more or less in the 1940s with a famous paper by the philosophers Hempel and Oppenheim. What they had decided was not so much that we could, after all, see deeply into the nature of things, but rather that we could have a notion of explanation that didn't require us to see deeply, that really only required us to grasp surface regularities. Fair enough?
Yeah, that sounds fair. Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to monologue too much about this,
No,
but we
that's fine.
probably have we probably agree quite a bit on these underpinnings.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I think immediately the philosophers of science began to expand the notion of explanation. Immediately after Hempel and Oppenheim, and they were drawn out by the way we ordinarily use notions of explanation and understanding, and noticed that they were operative well outside of physics and biology and psychology.
and so this new notion of explanation, or was it really just an attempt to say what the old notion was? I'm never quite sure what Hempel had in mind. Really just made understanding something a matter of seeing that it fit into some pattern of events. So it seems you might understand why it is that the sun rises in the morning simply by seeing that it rises every day in the morning. Is it that simple?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that's right?
Well, I don't think it's right, but I think it's simple.
It's surely that. For some, once the topic of explanation got started, then philosophers naturally, being a disputatious bunch, began to think of ways that Hempel might be wrong. And one of the things that came along 10, 20, 30 years later was the notion of causation, that to understand something, to explain something, you had to grasp something about the causal structure of the world. So
Yeah.
let's see what you think about that. True or false, JD? I mean, forgetting history for now, is that the way things really are? Is that what scientific explanation really is? A matter
Well,
of grasping causal structure?
I mean, that's roughly my view. I'm pretty sure it's roughly yours. And
It is roughly my view.
yeah, and there's this sort of generic understanding of explanation that just begins with causal notions and says that an explanation is just a description of the underlying causes that bring about the effect that you're interested in. So to have an account of the causal mechanisms, or at least the relevant causal mechanisms in some system, at least provides you with the potential of telling a plausible explanatory story about what brought about an effect.
Okay, so let's begin with what I think is a big consensus in philosophy today in 2013, which is that explanation in science has a lot to do with grasping causal structure.
Right.
Now, recently, this whole debate, well, it doesn't sound much like a debate so far because we've left out all the argument. This story about scientific explanation didn't much use one of the words that's in our discussion topic, which is understanding. But much more recently, I think I'm just talking about the last 10 years or so perhaps, philosophers have started talking about understanding as well as explanation. So, JD, why don't you say what you think the relation between those two is?
Right. Well, certainly when, just as a descriptive historical matter of fact, when scientists faced certain kinds of phenomena that they wanted to explain, they accepted explanations that conveyed some sense of understanding, or what I refer to as sense of understanding. And sometimes that sense of understanding came from being in possession of reasonably good theory about the phenomena. And in that case, the sense of understanding could be a reliable cue to genuine understanding. But in other cases, in cases where alchemists had certain kinds of theories about chemical combination that had to do with personality characteristics of the experimenter and so on, those theories were so bad that they couldn't survive even the sense of understanding that alchemists had. So you could have a sense of understanding while having a terrible explanation. And at the same time, it looks like you could have explanation without understanding, a kind of ontic sense of explanation, in which the description of the causal factors are accurate, but the person who's listening, or even perhaps the person who's doing the explaining, isn't properly cognitively situated to appreciate what the causes are. So,
okay, so let's just to be clear on everything that's on the table now. We have this notion of a good explanation. We have this notion of genuine understanding, and then we also have this notion of a sense of understanding.
Right.
And it sounds like all three of these things are separate enough that you can have one without the others.
Yeah, I think that's right. On a certain account of genuine understanding, you don't have it unless your belief is true, or at least approximately true. And so, that's a sort of the straightforward requirement. That can happen, that is, you can explain without producing understanding, as I was mentioning before, when you're not properly situated or your listener's not properly situated. So when the biologist Haldane said that he couldn't conceive that the mechanism of heritability was physical, we could take him at his word. He couldn't conceive of it. And he couldn't imagine that it was a physical mechanism, that heritability was a physical mechanism. So that's probably true. He probably couldn't conceive of it. But yet he was, anyone at that time would have been able to offer the genetic basis of heritability as an explanation. It would have been a reasonably good explanation.
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you what I think. I'll tell you what I think the relation between genuine understanding and genuine explanation is, which I think makes sense of some of the things you've said. And then you can either disagree with me or agree, and we'll move on to talking about the sense of understanding, which
Sure.
seems to be a distinct thing. So I think to understand something, say to understand the aurora borealis, or to understand how things are inherited in, say, sexually reproducing beings on Earth, is simply to grasp a good explanation of that fact. So let's go with the consensus for now, and we'll say that a good explanation is the right causal story about what's going on, the right causal story about heredity, say. Then genuine understanding is simply grasping in some sense. I can't tell you exactly what grasping is, but it involves a kind of a close epistemic relation. Grasping those causal relations, really seeing them for what they are. So if this is right, you can't have genuine understanding without having a good explanation.
Right.
You could have a good explanation if you have the thing in your hands, but you don't fully appreciate it for what it is. In fact, maybe many scientists are in this position much of the time. They're quite good with their theories, but if they haven't thought about them really hard, they may not see every connection. So they fall a little bit short of genuine understanding. And perhaps in the kind of case you were discussing with Haldane, even, you could have something more radical than that. I'm not sure.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, you have that neat argument in the manuscript on no understanding without explanation, where you implicate the idea of grasping. And there are a number of accounts that use the idea of grasping certain causal facts. And I think that may be right, that there's no understanding without explanation. The only problem that I see thus far is that nobody's really described the grasping relation in a psychologically taxonomic way. That is, we have a certain kind of intuitive sense of what grasping something cognitively might mean, but it's hard to say what the taxonomic psychological correlate is to something like direct apprehension, or having some kind of close epistemic relationship to the object. Would you look, say, in perceptual theory for a notion like recognitional capacity that just displayed a kind of discriminative capacity? Or isn't that enough to have understanding?
Well, I hate to agree with you, but I think that's more or less correct. The next big job for people who are interested specifically in understanding and not just explanation is to say more about this grasping relation. In fact, I would say the grasping relation is of great interest to everybody, to epistemologists everywhere.
Right.
If it's the kind of thing I think it is. Epistemologists used to think that what was really important was knowing, and knowing is pretty important. But it's possible to know things in a way where you don't really have much intimacy with what you know. So a lot of people know that, say, the theory of general relativity explains, say, the degree to which light rays are bent when they pass close by a very massive object. So there's knowledge there, but they don't really understand, because they don't really grasp the way those causal arrows go. You can know things in a rather shallow and surface way. This grasping relation is something a little bit deeper. But what we have so far to say about it is, in fact, not very much.
Yeah, I think that's, Woodward also mentions that, the sort of ordinary pattern of concept formation is that you begin with these sorts of superficial regularities, and what you get as you specify laws further is kind of deeper and deeper accounts of the causal nature of the object.
Mm-hmm. Right. Maybe, I suppose it might help to give a kind of example. So I might know that the Sunnis and the Shiites have significant different religious differences. But I might not really have any sense, if I'm a comfortable agnostic living in the West, of what that amounts to. I might, so this is an example that has less to do, well, I suppose it has something to do with understanding, doesn't it? Some people might even say that until I have lived in the Islamic world, until maybe even I have some personal conception of Islam, maybe I would have to even be Islamic myself. I do not fully understand, because I do not fully grasp the nature of these differences between Sunni and Shia Islam.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there may be, because genuine or the grasping relation may involve dimensions of similarity that are causally important. You know, when you're trying to understand differences like that, there can be empathic failures just because you don't know enough about, in the right kind of way, about what it's like to be the member of a particular group, say.
Right. It's an interesting question whether some very, very cold but super intelligent sociologist or anthropologist could understand everything there is to know about these relations without any actual empathy.
Right. I mean, I think
you've written a book about empathy, so I expect you have something to say about that.
Right. Well, actually, what I have to say about that has more to do with the history of the philosophy of the social sciences as well. So, it's that idea about there being empathic limitations, or that some sense of empathy is essential to social explanation, that led philosophers of social science to think that the social sciences were fundamentally different from the natural sciences when it came to explanation, and that it required special kinds of explanation to really uncover issues in the social sciences. That was, sort of in the sort of received view in the 40s and the 50s, and you even find it enshrined in critical theory in figures like Habermas, who thought that the social sciences involved Verstehen type processes, and the natural sciences didn't. But really, those Verstehen processes were efforts to understand. And as figures like Dick Miller pointed out when he talked about some of this philosophy of social science material, understanding was something that all scientists wanted to do, not just social scientists. So understanding was an enormous part of physical theorizing and biological theorizing, psychological theorizing. So it looked like there was at least nothing special with respect to the issue of causation that required social scientists to use Verstehen techniques.
Certainly, that's the way that social science in the English-speaking world, at least, seems to have gone.
Yeah.
That is, seeing itself as doing something that's not so different in many ways from the biologists or even the physicists. I'm talking about the majority here,
right,
because there are,
right.
of course, many people who would strenuously disagree with all of this in sociology and perhaps especially anthropology departments right now. But who would go along with the idea that just as in physics you're trying to trying to describe and grasp causal structure, so in biology, so in the social world, the same thing. The causal structure is more complicated, so the task is more complicated, but you might use very similar devices, statistical analysis and so on,
right,
to figure out where the causal arrows are pointing. And there's no special human capacity or need for lived experience to have understanding in these cases.
Right, and as a matter of fact, I think in the English-speaking world of social science, social scientists themselves are much more inclined to just construct things like regression models and of various kinds of political and social phenomena, and then just say that the explanation for certain kinds of events that they're trying to account for, the explanation just is the regression model. In other words, there are so many variables involved in the processes, they're so complicated that you can't appeal to a few causes and explain the effect. You just have to point to the model and say that, you know, each of the variables will explain a very small percentage of the variance, and this model just is the explanation for the phenomenon that we're interested in. You don't find that tendency. You don't find that tendency among, or not nearly as much among non-English speaking research in the social sciences.
Right, so that makes me think of Hempel again, back in the 1940s, saying that to explain something is to see how it fits into the regularity, see how it fits into a pattern of events. That's enough. Not to derive it as our modern day theorists of everything in physics and so on would like to do. You don't have to see how it connects to deep causal principles. Just to have the pattern of behavior derived from the data on paper gives you something like an explanation.
Right, right. And if if it's a big cause or just a couple of big causes that you're mentioning, then you may be able to be informal in specifying them. But otherwise, you have to kind of hunker down and construct a model in detail.
Right. What do you think about the new popularity, well, by new I mean in the last 10, 20 years, of evolutionary psychology in social science, an approach that looks like it is looking for deep causal principles, that doesn't spend so much time worrying about producing complicated mathematical models and spends a lot more time trying to explain behavior by pointing to some inchoate tendency in the brain that was honed 10,000, 50,000 years ago on the savannah.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of strains of that kind of approach, and in sort of traditional evolutionary psychology, there are many, of course, and people know these sorts of criticisms, many kinds of plausible stories that can be told that might not depend on having access to research, but spinning a story that has a certain kind of pleasing coherence or that relies on intuition. But oftentimes, the shortcomings of evolutionary psychology come from ignoring the complexity of the phenomenon itself and still using a kind of storytelling technique. So they'll try to rule out, plausible alternative explanations, but because there are so many causal factors involved and the same effect as a function may be brought about in many different ways, it's really difficult to constrain the range of plausible alternatives. So there are always alternative explanations that are very credible that invariably are not considered.
So you're being reasonably critical, and actually it'd be good for us to go on in a moment and talk about how people's desire for deep explanations gets them into trouble. But one thing that might be said in favor of this approach is it adds a little bit of depth, maybe the wrong depth in these cases, to explanations in the social sciences that perhaps seem a little bit superficial, the kind of explanation that is just a statistical model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think people are, it's right, I think, to be dissatisfied with that, even if evolution is perhaps not the place to go first in going a little bit deeper into the reasons for behavior and so on.
Yeah, I mean,
but let's, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking maybe we should spend a little bit of time talking about the trap of the sense of understanding, which you've written about quite influentially. where so far I've spent quite a bit of time talking about good explanation and genuine understanding, but we all think, at least in philosophy, we all think understanding is a wonderful thing to have, but the ways in which pursuing a sense of enlightenment can actually lead you up the garden path.
Yeah. I mean, there are, some of the points that I try to make about the sense of understanding in explanation, that our acceptance of an explanation is oftentimes determined by the sense of understanding it conveys, owes quite a bit to the sort of vocabulary that Descartes uses when he talks about the distinction between waking and dreaming life. There are no certain signs when we look. There are no certain signs that distinguish senses of understanding that lead to the truth and senses of understanding that lead to error. So, historically, you can look at some of the explanations.
Before you go on,
sure.
So just so that everyone knows what the sense of understanding is.
It's a kind of phenomenological state, and that you get when you're in the presence of some phenomenon that you want to explain, or when you attempt to explain something. And it may have to do with a sense of coherence or the fit of certain facts with a pattern of data. Is that what you wanted to know?
I think so, yeah. So the highest form of this sense would be this feeling of terrific insight into the nature of things, that you finally crack through the surface of reality, right, and now you see how it all fits together. And
yeah, there's a kind of eureka.
Wonderful kind of elation. Yeah, eureka is I think the technical Greek term for this
yeah.
feeling.
And or the aha notion of understanding, where suddenly your understanding is illuminated with great clarity for whatever reason. And the models for that are oftentimes problem-solving models. There are little lab tests that you can give people for solving problems, and when they solve the problem, they experience this kind of aha effect. But also, physicists like Richard Feynman wax sentimental about discoveries in physics and say things like, you can know that you were right just by looking at the equation, or, Kelvin would have some long equation and say, intuitively this just follows. Well, it followed for him. But it wasn't intuitive to most people. And, those sorts of psychological criteria oftentimes come up short, partly because you can have that sense even though your theory is really bad. And there are many good examples from the history of science.
All right. So I'm now going to get up from my chair for a moment and adjust the lighting slightly, because I'm losing a bit of light here. So I'm speaking out of turn. We'll resume in a moment. Okay. Well, hopefully the digital wizards at Philosophy TV will cut that little segment out of our conversation. Yeah. All right. So I think what would be great now is to have a example of one of these episodes where it seemed so good, that feeling, that you couldn't possibly be wrong, and yet you were wrong.
Yeah.
Well, not you personally, but
that's right.
Somebody.
Yeah.
So tell us a story, if you would.
Yeah. There are a number of different stories you could use. Aristotle, for example, oftentimes alluded to working authorities who would sometimes say that the way you get your goats or sheep to twin is to feed them a certain kind of pasturage, and you would get.
So when you say to get them to twin, you mean to give birth to twins?
Yeah, to give birth to twins. And there were, whenever that happened, of course, people thought that there was a beautiful and fluent explanation for why that happened. But it's not as though people were coding data or anything at the time. But there was, for example, there was an approach to determining whether a pregnant woman was going to give birth to a boy or a girl by baking a cake, in effect, with the breast milk. And if the cake came out crumbly, it would be one gender and not crumbly another. But these are laws of similarity that are operating here.
That sounds very plausible to me.
That's right. Well, there's a background theory that was largely hydraulic, that treated the liquid products as having significant causal powers, and in this case, diagnostic ones. So there's no question that people had a sense of understanding when they offered explanations like this. But their explanations were bad, even though their sense of understanding was very vivid. Now, people are driven to this sense of understanding in part from what people like William James called he refers to an unease of indecision. So that they're confronted with these phenomena they want to explain, and they're unsatisfied somehow until they can explain the phenomenon. And that feeling is what Charles Sanders Peirce referred to as turning a key back and forth in a lock. When you have that explanation where the facts fit some pattern. So that's just one example of what say a theory that nobody thinks is true, but led to explanations that carried very robust senses of understanding.
What about, here's another case which is quite different in that it was an important part of the development of science, but still turned out to be wrong. I'm thinking of the caloric theory of heat. So the idea that heat is a substance that flows like a liquid. Maybe a lot of these bad intuitions are about liquids one way or another.
Right.
And it makes a lot of sense intuitively. You heat one end of a metal bar or something like that, and the heat flows down the bar. In fact, thinking about it as flow is what led scientists to write down the correct equations for heat flow for the first time.
Right.
And even now, when we think about the correct explanation in terms of kinetic theory, where it's little vibrations slowly traveling down the bar, doesn't seem to me to be doesn't have quite the intuitive oomph. It's not quite as satisfactory as the false explanation from caloric theory.
Yeah, I mean, even cases of partial diffusion, I'd imagine, too, as the heat sort of spread across a room.
Right.
Yeah, same sort of intuition. So if you look at cases like that, it's hard to find a certain sign in the sense of understanding, and so hard to be persuaded when somebody says, the phenomenon is so striking, it has to be right. And the situation is made more complicated by the fact that sometimes when people have that feeling, they are right. Avogadro's number turns up, as Salmon points out, in so many different places. Commentators on it point out that that you've somehow latched onto a significant causal feature of the world increases in probability as you apply Avogadro's number to things like, Brownian motion or electrolysis or beta decay. And that kind of argument that is related to a no miracles kind of argument, that is a case of the sense of understanding that accompanies a good explanation.
Right. There's some things that are constantly getting us into trouble that if we didn't have, we'd get into even worse trouble.
Right.
Maybe the sense of understanding is one of those
Yeah,
things.
that's right. Well,
Uh,
sure. I mean,
it's just as well we have it, despite all the problems it causes for us.
in practical cases, it probably serves us very well, right? When you're dealing with other people and you have a sense that somebody's not telling you the truth, you can be an imperfect detector of somebody lying, but still perform at significantly above 50%.
Right. It might even perhaps some of these things that we take to be so closely linked to the ultimate truth about the way everything works are in fact fine-tuned to help us out in practical ways and work far less well than we would hope when it comes to pointing to the deep structure of things.
Yeah,
Like the idea of heat flow, for example. Uh, it's a great idea if you want to think about heat in a predictively useful way.
right.
Maybe there's something to this, the sense of understanding which we kind of treasure as an ultimate intellectual achievement is really a far more practical thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the feeling that you've understood some phenomenon in a deep way is so appealing that people seek that experience. The sort of feeling of wonder that's associated with a deep explanation, or what I think Freud referred to an oceanic feeling. Where you're aware of being located in some vast network of causes. And so people get very romantic about that, and it drives them to try to explain. But it also encourages people to accept explanations for that sense that it gives them, often prematurely.
Right. I suppose here we've come around again to a kind of a Hempelian lesson. So this is this Hempel again of the explanation in the 1940s. That explanation might, in fact, be potentially quite a shallow thing. It's
Right.
not the
Right.
it's not the deep insight into the nature of things that we hoped for, useful though it may be.
But not mere familiarity either.
Right, right. So what is it? What is the practical benefit of explaining things?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that explanation has going for it is its connection to causal notions, right? So if you're an experimenter and you're trying to figure out what the next move is once you've established some phenomenon, you give an explanation for it, and then you probe further at all the causes that that explanation mentions. So it actually, more than prediction and control, explanation is a kind of guide to future research if you take seriously the causal notions that are implicated in the explanation. Does that make sense, or is that useful?
Yes. No, I think that's a good answer. This is a question that greatly interests me. So you don't have to be I don't think you have to be a skeptic about the possibility of achieving something above and beyond simply satisfying your desires and realizing your ends, to also ask the question, what practical function explanation
Right,
play?
right.
So you can, in other words, you can think about the practical function of explanation without committing yourself to that somewhat depressing thought that all it is a kind of a practical device for helping us all to pass on our genes in that special very brainy human way to the next generation.
Right. I mean, even if you were very mocking of people's romantic attachment to, the wonder of deep explanation, explanation would still serve this very practical purpose.
Right. But it's not. Well, I don't want to say that there's something wrong with the idea that it attracts us to thinking more in ways about causal structure that we wouldn't otherwise. But I do think more needs to be said. So imagine a race just like us that doesn't care about explanation at all. This is a race of predictors and manipulators and controllers, but they don't think in terms of explanation. Maybe they have no sense of understanding. They've never had the oceanic feeling, as it were. How would they be any less motivated to look in the right place than we are. Isn't it enough just to want to predict things to push you to figure out causal structures, as long as you think that causal structures are ultimately connected to regularities in the right sorts of ways?
Right. So, I mean, I guess one virtue of explanation, as opposed to just articulating individual causes, is that in order to have the sort of understanding that explanation is thought to offer, you might have to develop a broader account of how the causes are related. And so you get some aspects of the unification of the world as well as just some corner of it.
Yeah, one thing I've wondered when thinking about this question is whether the answer is something to do with a push to burrow deeper, to go down a level, or if that's the right way to think about it. Is
that a unifying impulse?
Thinking in terms of thinking in terms of causation, looking for mechanisms in the sense of not simply being content to know exactly the way that this box behaves, but wanting to take the top off the box and look inside to see why it behaves that way. That I take to be a classic expression of explanatory curiosity. Ultimately, thereby discovering more regularities once you look inside and see what the little pieces are and how all those pieces are put together. I can't say that the right sort of predictor wouldn't make the same decisions.
Right.
But there's a sense in which what the right sort of predictor is doing when they take the top off the box, when they say, I know the regularity, but I want to see all the little bits all the little sub-regularities that add up to that regularity. It's very natural to say that what the predictor is doing is looking deeper.
Right.
Maybe for purely predictive purposes, but looking deeper. And that rings my explanatory bell. It makes me think, okay, so there's a connection between pursuing predictive knowledge in the right sort of way and thinking about getting under things, more deeply into things.
Right.
Even if the practical use goes only up to the point where you've figured out the ultimate regularities and no deeper than that.
Yeah, I mean, part of that digging deeper, I think, is what traditional reductionists have always thought that they were doing. When they tried to ground the higher level phenomena and lower level phenomena, and then the sorts of at the same time, while they saw a unifying impulse there, non-reductionist figures thought that their approach was more unifying, in the sense that you can misrepresent, as Alan Garfinkel puts the point. You can, by looking at the hyper-concrete entities, the little entities that make up a process, you can misrepresent the sensitivity of the system to changes. And I think that's part of what you're attempting to identify when you take the lid off of the box. You're trying to see whether the same effect would have occurred even if the physical substrate were slightly different, whether the system had a certain kind of compositional plasticity that would allow you to substitute other causes, and you could still have the same effects. And that's one way that you could look. Right. That's not the only way you could look deeper. You could do analyses of causation to try to make it the case that causal notions are not unreduced. But another way is certainly to try to specify the reductive basis of macroscopic phenomena.
So this is we're stumbling into a new question here, the question of whether it's always better to go deeper and add more details if you're interested in explaining something or understanding something.
Right.
So quite a bit of my own quite a bit of my own work on explanation has been about this question, actually partly inspired by Garfinkel, of what the right level of abstraction for explanation, which of course is going to depend on what you're explaining. The level of abstraction where the way I think about it is where you get just the things that make a difference to what you're trying to explain, and you leave out all the details that don't make a difference. I think even when you're being quite abstract, you still learn more by going deeper, but only with respect to the difference makers, as I call them, as many of us working on this topic call them. So there will be many irrelevant details, but there'll also be a story about how the behavior of the system you're examining is rooted in, ultimately, I suppose, fundamental physics. And that will be part of the explanatory story. But I know a lot of philosophers disagree with that. They think in biology, say, there may be a point below which there's no point in going. It's just not the case that there's, let's pick a particular example. You're trying to understand how, say, the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria works. So why is it that these bacteria become more and more resistant to the standard antibiotics as time goes on? The explanation being to do with natural selection for resistance, of course.
Well, if that's true, then
to my mind,
it's worth knowing that it's true, if it's true, right? So,
absolutely.
Right. So the only way you can figure that out is by going deeper and see whether it adds anything to the narrative.
But some people think you want to be able to tell a story about natural selection. You'll want to say something about the way that these traits that the bacteria have that confer resistance passed on from bacterium to bacterium, and so on. But there's a certain point at which a certain level in the great ladder of the sciences that you don't need to go below. So although you do need to go down perhaps to molecular biology to understand heritability and how the resistance itself works, of course, as a molecular thing. You don't need to go down to the level of quantum physics, although in some sense it all works the way it does because of quantum physics. I don't see any principled stopping place. I think any place where you say, well, after this, nothing matters anymore. But some philosophers do think that biologists, well, I suppose I agree biologists shouldn't be thinking about quantum physics because that's just not their expertise. But don't think that the physics is relevant in any scientific way at all to understanding these phenomena. So I know, for example, the philosopher of science, Philip Kitcher, has written in this vein. So for him, the always taking the lid off the box is not always a good thing.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm inclined to think that a lot of the pressure that people feel in those sorts of cases to not look deeper might have to do with certain theoretical attachments they have about what a worthwhile avenue of research is or not.
Right.
So,
well, I know one. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to give an example. There are individuals in, say, comparative sensory research, and people who study language in a kind of comparative sensory research context, who think that looking at the relationship between language use in humans and the ability of non-human animals to make certain kinds of language-like distinctions is just not a useful theoretical endeavor. I'm inclined to be in that camp. But at the same time, I'm perfectly willing to let the data decide that matter. I don't think there should be a moratorium on research in the field. I just think that it's likely that research toward that end is not going to be fruitful. And then all of the incentives will line up in such a way that people will stop doing research on it.
Right. So you see more of a practical
Yeah.
explanation. That also is my way of thinking here. Uh, in particular, if you're a biologist, say a molecular biologist working on antibiotic resistance, say, uh, you shouldn't think about quantum physics because that's not your expertise.
Now, I guess it's
So
always
there is a
possible.
kind of a
It's always possible that there's principle behind that pragmatic approach. Also, that one reason you shouldn't is that to use the phrase again, that you would be misrepresenting the sensitivity of the system changes. So, you make it sound like whether or not a certain function at a higher level is carried out depends on its having the physical substrate that it has, the specific substrate that it has. So if looking deeper means looking at smaller and smaller parts, then maybe we ought not do it if we're not yet clear what level of explanation we're looking at.
So I would distinguish two kinds of fundamental physical detail, the sort that are not difference makers. Those are genuinely explanatorily irrelevant. It's a mistake to worry about that stuff for explanatory reasons. It's that's wrong. But there's going to be some aspects of the chemistry of these things that are certainly relevant to the story, and those aspects, which are bits of quantum chemistry, really are relevant. They really are difference makers. But biologists certainly shouldn't be concerning themselves with them. There should be a division of explanatory labor where the quantum chemists are able to come in and give a certain kind of story here.
Right, right. Well, I was wondering whether we should ascend from the trenches and see if there's any, if not grand finale, some final remarks.
Sure. One way to finish off would be to talk a little bit about explanation outside of science. So we're both philosophers of science. That's what we do. That's what we're good at. We think about understanding in science, explanation in science. But there's plenty of other arenas of inquiry where people use these terms.
Right.
Right. So some people in philosophy of mathematics are interested in mathematical explanation. It seems to me that sometimes, especially if you focus on the term understanding, it feels like we get understanding from places where causal structure is really not obviously what's at issue. Some people say they understand human behavior better because they read novels or
Right.
see movies.
Or for mathematical explanation, causation is unlikely to play a big role.
Right. So these are two really rather different topics, of course. With mathematical explanation, it seems causation isn't part of the picture. One thing to look for is something like causation in the mathematical world, some kind of structure, dependent structure that makes things the way they are, the grasping of which constitutes mathematical understanding.
Yeah.
That requires some heavy-duty philosophy of mathematics, however. So I myself, at this point, am prepared to, as they say, pass the baton on to people who know what they're doing.
Well, I guess the same goes in cases of understanding art and understanding literature. But yeah, the model would be quite different because there might be heuristics that you could use to understand art that have a kind of causal basis, even though you couldn't formalize the process.
Well, one story about novel reading is really it just turns you into a better amateur psychologist.
Yeah, and I think I hear claims like that, and I always wonder what the non-anecdotal evidence is. But then I feel very flat-footed about asking that. It might also, it might have other effects that, we don't oftentimes think about. It might make you cagier. I don't know whether being a
Cagier.
cagier, like you understand human motivations better, perhaps from reading mystery novels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't know whether that, as there are some people who, for example, say that literature humanizes people because they can sort of internalize moral codes by putting themselves in other people's shoes and so on. Um, yeah, I just don't know whether that's true or not. But it feels very flat-footed to propose that it's an empirical question and that it's we should test it.
I think a lot of there are certainly a lot of people, and I would be quite sympathetic myself, would say that this has got to be missing the point somehow, or at least partially missing the point, that there's a kind of understanding and insight that comes from literature or art that might possibly express itself in greater psychological expertise, but that is really only a side effect. There's some. It's a big question though, whether when you read a great novel and you feel that sense of understanding, whether there's anything behind it.
Right. Yeah. So it's really a question of I think in part in what ways, if any, it's educative. And it's worth being specific about, I think, because it's a key part of people's humanistic training as well.
Well, there's a lot to be said for great literature and great art that doesn't hinge on understanding or explanation, I suppose.
Right. All right. So shall we sign off?
I guess we've now gone to the limits of our expertise and perhaps a little bit beyond them. Maybe we can finish by saying that there's still a lot of work to do, and I think maybe especially a lot of work to do in the question of understanding.
Yeah, I think so.
Both in science and elsewhere.
I think so. It's understanding has always been the desire for understanding has always been a sort of tacit driving force in work on explanation. And I think what's happened in the last 10 years is that that's just been made more explicit.
So it's still a new and exciting topic that we can sign people up for. And I hope this little conversation will result in at least a few more recruits to the cause.
Okay. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it was great to talk. We really need to get together more often, although there's no need to record ourselves next time.
That's right. I prefer that we don't. Okay. So we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Okay.